So we're going to continue talking about actually data collection. And one of the things we want to just generally consider is the guidelines for evaluating the effectiveness of data collection. I can't really go into too much detail here, but we do want to consider that every source of data we want to think about, do we have the time to collect the data we need? So we can identify, for example, that we may need a certain amount of data, but do we have the time and luxury to collect that data? We do need to factor in the cost of data collection. So will it be something that we can afford to do? What compromises need to be made? We do need to recognize the organizational culture and norms. So an open cultured, a culture that is open and is used to having its opinions asked, and the norms are to give truthful responses. We're going to get a lot better data than if we have a culture that's closed, is not used to communication, and the norm is to kind of keep your knowledge to yourself. It's going to be a lot harder to gather data. We also need to recognize the Hawthorne effect in data collection. And basically, the Hawthorne effect is just a general concept that the act of measuring anything changes to some degree the actual object that we're measuring. In other words, just evaluating and just gathering data will often have a bit of an effect. So if an organization, for instance, has never had a public opinion poll before and is suddenly asking people about their job satisfaction, what they think about their benefits, not only are we going to gather information of what do people think about their benefits and their job satisfaction, we'll also have the Hawthorne effect that we'll probably see a slight increase in job satisfaction based on the fact that there's a perception, wow, people are listening, the company's actually caring about these finally. And all of that gets to that first point that I purposely skipped at the top, the validity of the data. In other words, we want to do everything we can to try to make sure the data we're collecting is truthful and as close to representing the reality of what's going on in the organization as possible. And that's a process of not only asking these questions, but also making sure that we're asking the right questions, so that we're not pre-presuming problems. We're really asking people just to give us the real data, the reality of the situation. The rest of this module, I'm mainly going to focus on diagnostic models that will often guide the kind of data we want to gather. So models may be used to analyze the structure, culture, and behavior of an organization, and they play a critical role in actually how we decide to intervene. But not only that, they often somewhat dictate what kind of data we want to collect. There's three major models that influence data collection in this phase of organizational development. And they kind of play into various differences in how they look at the organization and what parts they're looking at. We're first going to talk about the differentiation integration model. This is a way of looking at organizations as the interaction between subsystems. So basically, if the problem that you're trying to identify in an organization is not within one department or one team, but it's in a group of teams or how various teams interact with each other, so how information flows from team A to team B to team C. Or there's a problem on the production line, but there's different work teams that work in tandem on that production line. We're probably going to take a differentiation integration model approach to what kind of data we need. Socio-technical systems model is a model that's actually looking at how the interaction between the actual processes of the organization and those social aspects are occurring. So if we think there's basically a problem with, we're not sure if it's the processes or how people view the processes that it's a problem in the organization, we may take a socio-technical subsystems approach. And finally, there's force field analysis. And force field analysis is better when we're actually looking for clear organizational change in process. Because force field analysis is basically going to look at what are the things that are trying to stop change and what are the things that are going to drive change. So we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. And again, we're looking at these not only as initial models that may help us decide what interventions to use, they're also going to help us decide what kind of data we want to gather. So they are diagnostic models. So the first one is differentiation integration model. So the stress in this model is analytic diagnosis of the differences in communication or differences in various parts of your teams or departments or organizations. So basically, if you're actually analyzing a problem in an organization and one of your initial tasks is to identify who is this intervention going to affect? What are the components? What are the stakeholders that are actually doing the processes that we're examining right now? If that model starts to become one where you're looking at multiple teams or multiple departments, you may be wanting to look at a differentiation integration model to move forward. So it's basically used for interdepartmental issues, usually communication issues, but they can also be production issues. It collects data on the activities, interactions, and norms of each of the components in the model. And the components here are going to be teams or departments. And the objective is to help the departments understand each other and to achieve integration and communication better. So steps in the implementation of this model, it begins with the study of the degrees of differentiation between the unions. So basically, how different are each of these teams or departments? And then it analyzes integration and cooperation between the units. So not only how different are they, how do they communicate? And it provides a basis for structural or cultural change in departments. Now, again, this is not a model that is going to be used to necessarily, this isn't an intervention model. This is a model that helps us identify where an intervention and what type of intervention needs to actually be done. So it usually examines units, so departments, teams, project groups, using 4 characteristics of the environment: the degree of departmental structure, the time orientation of the members, the interpersonal orientation of the members, and the members' orientations to the goals. So what is the structure? Is it highly structured, highly unstructured? Is there a very strong focus on deadlines and time, or is there more of an amorphous, we get things done when we need to get them done? Is there a highly social nature to this team, or is it mainly just focused on tasks? And then the task, how focused is it on actually orienting towards the goals? So looking at these 4 factors, we can start to actually kind of graph out what the various departments look like and how they differ from each other. So here's an example. Here's an example. So we could, for example, be looking at 4 organizational units that have to interact with each other to get a final product done: the finance department, the research department, the marketing department, and the production department. So we're going to try to basically kind of determine high or low on departmental structure, orientation towards time, short versus long, so short-term projects or long-term projects, members' orientation towards each other, permissive and open versus controlling or directive, and members' orientation towards the goal. Are they invested in what part of the goal? So, for example, finance department is focused towards investment goals. Research is focused on the science goals. Marketing our market goals, and production department is focused on the product. We'd also probably delineate whether that was a strong focus or not. For example, the marketing department may actually have more of a focus towards social interaction than any particular goals within that organization, even though their goal itself is marketing. By creating this chart, we can start to look to see where would there be natural strife between various groups. So if the finance department is constantly looking at the short-term goals, the research department is constantly looking at long-term goals, that's a sign that there's going to be some conflict there between those 2 groups. One group is wanting to know, what's it costing now, how much is it costing, how much is the bottom line, how much of the budget is being eaten into every week, while the research department is like, no, we need a budget that extends for a year plus. We don't know how long it's going to take us to get this project done, and we need more time and we need more leeway. So this isn't necessarily going to give us the solutions, but it is going to let us conceptualize where problems may be occurring. The socio-technical systems model, it basically looks at organizations, and again, we're looking at sub-parts of the organizational parts that we think the problem lays in or is involved with that we need to do an intervention. And whatever that part is, whether it's a department, whether it's a team, whether it's a series of departments, this model is looking at the integration between the social system and the technical system of that interaction. And it's a belief that the 2 systems are interrelated. Our diagnosis in this case, is basically looking at the interrelationships between teams and also individuals, and the type of feedback required between each subsystem. So it's really looking at the organization from a view of what are the actual task focuses versus social aspects that result in positive productivity within whatever system we're looking at. So we'll take a look at a model of this that'll hopefully make it a little bit more clear. So if we're collecting data from this viewpoint, what we first want to identify is the actual social systems. So individual and team behaviors, the team organization and team cultures, management practices, leadership styles, degrees of communication and openness, individual needs and desires. So this really is measuring both the leadership structure, the management structure, the communication structure, and what do the individuals themselves look like. So if you've got a team of very extroverted salespeople, that's going to be a different social system than a team of highly introverted engineers in a research and development. So what does this social system look like? We then look at the technical system. What is the actual task that this group is doing? What is the type of productivity? What kind of technology is being done? What level of interdependence is in the group? So can they basically create their own products? Do they have to do pooled work where everyone has to be involved to get it done? Is it sequential work? What is the physical work settings? What is the complexity of the process? What is the variety and analyzability of this process? What's the nature of the raw materials? And what are the time pressures? So by defining these two systems, we can then start to decide what elements of those two systems need to be changed to basically design a jointly optimizing system that takes the strength of both the social system and the technical system to focus on the goals and values using the skills and abilities of the individuals. So this is usually going to be where the previous model was mainly focused at how various teams interact and are different from each other. This is more looking at more of kind of a cultural climate view of what is the job and are is the organizational social aspect, the management team, the leadership team, and the individuals in those teams working well to get the technical part of the job done. And again, our idea is to try to identify or diagnose areas for improvement. Force field analysis model is a behavioral balance between opposing forces. There's restraining forces, so these act to keep the organization to the status quo, to keep things stable, and then driving forces that act to change the organization. When forces are equal, organizations basically become in a state of equilibrium or quasi-stationary. We don't see movement. So our analysis in this case is determining what forces to increase or decrease to allow change. So force field analysis model is really good when we're trying to implement one clearly, objectively definable intervention or process change. Force field analysis is going to be a good diagnostic model to use. So force field analysis, basically, the data we're gathering is to identify any forces that tend to increase the negativity that we're trying to find. For example, if we're trying to affect absentee rate, we have a current rate of absenteeism from a low to high scale, and we're trying to get it down. The first thing we want to do is what elements increase absentee rate. So inclement weather and climate, poor supervision, no monetary ownership in the company, below standard vacation time, no personal leave policy. Those are all things that would make people more likely to be absent, to call in sick. What forces tend to decrease the absentee rate? Rewards to teams for improving performance, pay tied to company profits, management training for supervisors, fear of losing job, commitment to the team, interest in the work. Once we have these two lists of factors, we have what would both increase or decrease the policy we're trying to change. We can now identify things we can either add to, in other words, we can add forces to decrease the rate, or things to remove things that were naturally increasing the rate. We want to basically change the balance to start moving that bar. So just some warning signs to look for in the diagnostic process. Do recognize confidentiality is issues when collecting data. So whenever possible, you're wanting to be able to reassure people that their individual responses are not going to be allowed into the hands of decision makers. Then that's going to help you get good data. You're going to get better data. You're going to get more honest data. We do want to avoid overdiagnosing, and overdiagnosing is basically where we're going into minutia. We're trying to find basically a good balance where we have enough data to make a decision, but we're not getting stuck in analysis paralysis, where we're just gathering more and more and more data and never feeling like we have enough to make a final decision. We want to avoid crisis diagnoses. Now, sometimes this is not going to be possible when a real crisis is happening, but basically we are wanting to hopefully, and this is one of the reasons that I stress, organizations work best if they can get themselves into a culture of true organizational development, where we're never in a situation where we're having to do a crisis diagnosis, where we have the time to do this right. We do want to worry about threatening or overwhelming diagnosis. So small changes are usually going to be more successful, and this again plays into that reason to stay in OD and not OT. OT transformations usually are fairly threatening and overwhelming. We have to change or we're going under. The problem is that is already somewhat setting yourself up for failure because you are trying to take on a very large process very quickly. OD works best when it is doing minor positive changes in a planful way. We also want to be aware that we tend to start having our own favored diagnoses. So, just like anything, we start to build up our own stereotypes of what is typically wrong with an organization. A good example of this is a lot of external practitioners in OD. Their go to intervention is basically looking at it from a differentiation model viewpoint. In other words, the problem is going to be in differences between teams and how they communicate, and that their intervention then is going to be team training and team trust building and team interaction or interventions. Well, that may work in many situations, but we want to make sure that we're not doing that simply because it's our comfort zone. We also want to make sure that we're not diagnosing the actual symptoms and not the problems themselves. What we are really wanting to get out in this process is not a symptom. So, for example, we may find that there is a problem with the benefits of an organization, and the symptom is a low job satisfaction. We want to make sure that we don't then target on, well, let's just increase job satisfaction, ignoring the problem of basically the organization not providing benefits that are similar to other organizations, which are now basically dragging off the clients or basically your employees. They're leaving because it's not just that their job satisfaction is low and they're leaving. Their job satisfaction is low is because they know they could get better benefits elsewhere and they're just waiting to leave.